You ever wonder how researchers go beyond like simple correlations
Yeah.
to really uncover the hidden mechanisms driving the things we see in the world around us?
Yeah.
Like, how do they figure out not just that two things are related,
Right.
but what's actually connecting them?
That's where regression analysis comes in
Okay.
and why it's such a powerful tool in a researcher's arsenal.
Yeah.
It allows us to ask those why and how questions and get much more nuanced answers than we could with like simpler methods.
That's exactly what I was hoping to unpack from this research methodology chapter you sent.
Right.
It really dives deep into regression analysis, and honestly,
Yeah.
I'm kind of fired up to see how it all
It's a
worked.
fascinating field.
Yeah.
And the chapter you sent highlights some key techniques like moderation, mediation, and anencovia,
Okay.
which are all about adding layers of understanding to those relationships we observe.
Let's start with moderation.
Sure.
This one feels particularly relevant because, let's be honest, how many times have we heard this leads to that, only to find out later it's way more complicated than that?
All the time.
Right.
Moderation helps us account for those nuances.
Okay.
Instead of just saying X leads to Y, it's like saying, hold on, the strength of that relationship depends on Z.
Okay.
Z is our moderator.
So give me an example.
Okay.
How about that classic idea that more resources lead to better performance for companies?
Perfect example.
Okay.
It might seem intuitive that more resources equal better performance.
Yeah.
But what if we bring in a moderator, like the type of environment a company's operating in?
Okay.
The impact of those resources might be very different for companies in stable versus rapidly changing environments.
Now that you mention it, I can see how a company in a stable market might benefit from slowly accumulating resources,
Right.
whereas a company in a volatile market might need to be much more adaptable and nimble.
Exactly.
Those extra resources might actually hinder their ability to pivot quickly.
Exactly. And that's the power of moderation. It reveals these conditional relationships that we might otherwise miss.
Right.
But as the chapter points out, there are some common pitfalls researchers need to avoid when using moderation analysis.
Yeah, like measurement error.
Right.
Isn't it pretty much impossible to measure anything perfectly, especially when we're dealing with complex concepts in the real world?
It's a constant challenge.
Yeah.
Even small errors in how we measure things like firm resources can have a ripple effect on our understanding of how those resources moderate the relationship with performance.
Right.
Imagine our measuring stick is a little off.
Yeah.
Everything we measure after that will be skewed.
And the chapter calls out that a lot of studies on moderation don't even address measurement error.
Right.
That's a little unnerving, isn't it?
It highlights the importance of being critical consumers of research.
Okay.
We need to look at how variables are measured, not just take the findings at face value.
Okay.
Another important consideration is the scope of the study, or the range of data being considered.
What do you mean by scope in this context?
It's about making sure the study sample is representative of the broader population or phenomenon being investigated.
Okay.
For example, if we're looking at how company size moderates the relationship between innovation and profit, but our study only includes massive corporations, what are we missing?
We're missing out on all the potential insights from small to mid-sized businesses.
Exactly.
It's like we're only looking at a tiny slice of the pie chart instead of the whole thing.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that limited perspective could lead to misleading conclusions.
Right.
We might assume size doesn't matter for innovation when it's just that our study was too narrow in its focus.
So moderation is about understanding those it depends factors.
Yes.
And making sure we're not overgeneralizing from limited data.
Exactly.
What about mediation, which the chapter calls the detective work of regression analysis? What clues are we trying to uncover there?
Mediation helps us understand the why behind a relationship.
Okay.
Let's say studies show companies with more diverse leadership teams tend to be more innovative.
Right.
Mediation aims to uncover the mechanism,
Okay.
the connecting link. That explains why that is.
It's like we're tracing the path from point A to point B,
Yes.
figuring out what's happening in between.
Exactly.
Give me an example of how that might play out in the diversity and innovation scenario.
Well, maybe diverse teams are better at generating different perspectives, right?
Right.
That diversity of thought could lead to more creative problem solving and ultimately more innovative solutions.
So it's not just diversity directly causing innovation.
Right.
It's that diversity is fostering this environment of different perspectives, which then fuels the innovation engine.
Exactly.
There's a whole internal process happening.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of mediation analysis.
Okay.
It allows us to peel back the layers and see those pathways that connect the dots.
Right.
Of course, like with any research method,
Sure.
there are potential pitfalls to watch out for.
It's like we're mapping out the chain reaction,
Right.
seeing how one thing leads to another.
Yeah.
But the chapter mentions 6 potential issues researchers can run into with mediation analysis. One of them,
Yeah.
assuming a direct relationship must exist to even consider mediation,
Right.
seems particularly counterintuitive.
It's a trap that's easy to fall into.
Yeah,
We tend to look for the most straightforward explanation,
right.
but sometimes the magic is happening in those indirect pathways.
Okay.
Just because we don't see a strong direct link doesn't mean there isn't a powerful, more nuanced story unfolding behind the scenes.
So even if, on the surface, diversity doesn't seem to directly impact innovation,
Right.
when we look closer,
Yeah.
we might find this whole A and B path where diversity actually is making a difference, but through a less obvious route.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important not to dismiss findings prematurely.
Right.
We need to be open to those indirect connections,
Okay.
even if they're not immediately apparent.
Okay.
But it's not enough to just prove that mediation exists.
Right.
We need to know how strong those indirect effects are.
Right, because a weak link in a chain is still a weak link, even if it's part of a longer, more intricate chain.
Exactly.
How do researchers determine the strength of those indirect paths?
There are specific statistical tests that can estimate the magnitude of both the indirect and direct effects.
Okay.
This allows researchers to say, yes, this mediating factor is at play, and here's how much of the overall effect it's accounting for.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
It's not just about whether a bridge exists, but also about how much weight that bridge can actually support.
exactly. And this ties into another critical point the chapter raises,
Okay.
the importance of theory-driven mediation analysis.
Okay.
Sometimes researchers will throw in a direct effect in their statistical models,
Uh-huh.
even when their underlying theory suggests full mediation.
So if the theory predicts that the direct path should disappear when we account for the mediator,
Yes,
our statistical model should reflect that.
precisely.
Yeah.
It's about aligning our statistical analysis with the theoretical story we're trying to tell.
Right.
If the theory proposes full mediation,
Right.
where the entire effect is transmitted through the mediator,
Uh-huh.
then testing a model with a direct effect muddies the waters.
So we need to be careful not to let our statistical tools dictate how we interpret the findings.
Right.
The theory should guide the analysis, not the other way around.
Absolutely. It's about using the right tool for the job and being precise in how we test our theories.
Okay.
Now, all of this gets even more interesting and
Okay.
potentially more complex
Uh-huh.
when we start considering the element of time.
Okay, how does time factor into mediation analysis?
Well, the very nature of mediation suggests a sequence of events, right?
Yeah.
Something happens that leads to something else,
Yeah.
which then leads to the outcome.
Right.
But a lot of studies on mediation
Yeah.
use cross-sectional data,
Okay.
meaning they only capture a single point in time.
So it's like taking a snapshot of a company's diversity, the level of diverse perspectives within teams, and their innovation output, but all at the same moment in time.
Yeah, exactly.
We can't tell what came first.
That's the limitation of cross-sectional data.
Okay.
We can see the relationships,
Right.
but we can't definitively say what's causing what.
Right.
It's like trying to understand a story from a single photograph.
Right.
To really understand the sequence of events, we need a different approach.
We need to see the whole movie, not just one still frame.
Exactly.
Mm.
Longitudinal designs, where data is collected at multiple points in time,
Okay.
are much more powerful for studying mediation.
Yeah.
They let us see how variables change in relation to each other over time,
Right.
giving us a much better understanding of cause and effect.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But I imagine longitudinal studies are much more resource intensive, both in terms of time and cost.
They are,
Yeah.
which is why they're not always feasible.
Right.
But it's important to be aware of the limitations of cross-sectional data when interpreting mediation findings.
Okay.
It's not always possible to disentangle those temporal relationships.
So we have to consider the design of the study,
Yes.
not just the statistical techniques used to
Right.
get the full picture.
Exactly.
But regardless of the design, it seems like measurement error is something that always needs to be accounted for.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Measurement error doesn't discriminate.
Right.
It can affect any type of research.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the chapter points out that it's often inadequately addressed in mediation analysis.
So even if we have this elegant statistical model and a robust study design,
Right.
if we're not measuring our variables accurately,
Yeah,
it's all for naught.
that's the harsh reality.
Wow.
Our findings are only as good as the measures we use.
Right.
And when we're dealing with complex concepts,
Yeah.
like diversity of perspectives,
Right.
finding accurate and reliable measures can be incredibly challenging.
It's not like we can just whip out a measuring tape and quantify the diversity of thought within a team.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It requires careful instrument development and validation. Researchers often use multiple indicators or measures to capture different facets of the underlying concept.
So instead of trying to measure the size of a cloud with a ruler,
Yes.
we use different instruments to measure its density, its movement, and its precipitation to get a more complete picture.
Exactly.
We get a better sense of the thing itself.
Precisely. And there are statistical techniques like structural equation modeling,
Okay.
or SIM,
Uh-huh.
which can help account for measurement error when we have multiple indicators.
Oh, okay.
Think of it as a noise filter,
Yeah.
trying to isolate the signal we're interested in.
So SIM is like a more sophisticated tool for dealing with the messiness of real-world data.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
It helps us model those complex relationships between multiple variables
Yeah.
while acknowledging that our measurements aren't perfect.
All right.
Of course, no tool is foolproof.
Sure.
SEMN has its own set of assumptions and limitations,
Right.
but it's one way researchers try to address the ever-present challenge of measurement error.
It's like we're constantly trying to refine our understanding of both the phenomena we're studying and the tools we use to study them.
Absolutely.
There's always more to learn, both about the world and about how we make sense of the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what makes research so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's a continuous journey of discovery.
Uh-huh.
And the more we understand the tools and techniques at our disposal,
Right.
the more equipped we are to navigate the complexities of human behavior and the social world.
It's amazing how many layers there are to unpack when it comes to like something like regression analysis.
Yeah.
It seemed pretty straightforward at first, but
Right.
the deeper we dive, the more I realize
Yeah.
it's as much about the researcher's judgment and choices as it is about the statistical techniques themselves.
That's a great observation.
Yeah.
It's not just about plugging numbers into a formula.
Right.
It's about thinking critically about the questions we're asking, the data we're using,
Uh-huh.
and the assumptions we're making throughout the entire research process.
Right.
And speaking of assumptions,
Yeah.
we need to circle back to this too much of a good thing effect.
Okay.
It really challenges us to reconsider some fundamental beliefs about how the world works.
Right. It flips that common saying, if a little is good, more must be better, on its head.
Exactly.
Suddenly we're faced with the possibility that there's a tipping point where something that's beneficial in moderation becomes detrimental in excess.
Exactly. And it's not just an interesting quirk.
Right.
It has significant implications for how we interpret research findings.
Okay.
What if some studies find a positive relationship between two things,
Right.
while others find no relationship or even a negative one,
Right.
simply because they're looking at different segments of the curve?
It's like everyone's looking at the same map, but focusing on different regions.
Right.
One researcher might be zoomed in on a mountainous area, while another is looking at a flat plain.
Exactly.
They might come to very different conclusions about the overall terrain,
Right.
even though they're looking at the same map.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And it highlights the importance of considering the possibility of these nonlinear relationships.
Okay.
We can't assume that a straight line accurately reflects how things operate in the real world.
Right.
It might be a curve, a wave, or even a roller coaster.
Okay. But how do we even begin to study those more complex relationships?
Right.
It seems incredibly difficult to pinpoint those inflection points, those moments on the graph where things shift from just right to too much.
You're right. It's definitely a challenge.
Yeah.
Traditional research methods often rely on large sample sizes and robust statistical power to detect even small effects.
Uh-huh.
But when we're dealing with the TMGT effect, those subtle curves can easily get lost in the noise,
Right.
especially if the effect is small or the data is messy.
So it's like trying to hear a whisper in a hurricane.
Exactly.
We need a way to amplify that signal.
Precisely. And that's where more advanced techniques come in.
Okay.
The chapter mentions meta-analysis as one promising avenue,
Okay.
instead of relying on a single study.
Right. Meta-analysis allows us to combine data from multiple studies,
Okay.
which gives us a much wider lens to work with.
It's like gathering perspectives from all those different researchers who are looking at different parts of the map.
Exactly.
We get a more comprehensive view of the terrain by combining their insights.
Exactly. And instead of just calculating an average correlation across all the studies,
Right.
we can use meta-analysis to model how the relationship between variables changes across the full spectrum of data.
Oh.
We can start to see where that relationship might level off or even reverse as we move to higher levels.
That's fascinating. So we're not just looking for the presence or absence of an effect.
Right.
We're mapping out the entire trajectory of the relationship.
Exactly. Another powerful technique is growth modeling,
Okay.
which allows us to track how relationships between variables change over time.
Okay.
This is crucial for studying the TMGT effect,
Right.
because those tipping points often emerge gradually,
Right.
not as sudden shifts. So instead of just measuring a plant's height on a single day, we're tracking its growth over several weeks to see how that growth changes over time. Does
Exactly.
it thrive at a certain height?
Right.
Does its growth accelerate or slow down at a certain point?
Yeah.
It gives us a much more dynamic understanding.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And that's the power of growth modeling.
Okay.
It allows us to see those dynamic changes and pinpoint potential inflection points where the relationship changes direction.
This too much of a good thing effect has given me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
It seems relevant not just for research,
Right.
but for life in general.
Absolutely.
Like, are there things that we think if a little's good, a lot's better, but it's actually not?
Exactly.
Well, that's our deep dive into the fascinating world of regression analysis. We've covered moderation, mediation,
It's been fun.
the challenges of measurement error, and
Yeah.
even touched on this mind-bending too much of a good thing effect.
It's a good one.
I feel like I've leveled up my research knowledge today.
It's been my pleasure to join you on this journey. And remember, this is just the beginning.
Right.
The more we question our assumptions and embrace the complexity of the world, the more we open ourselves up to new insights and discoveries.
And who knows, maybe we'll uncover a few too much of a good thing effects in our own lives along the way. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Until next time, keep those requests coming, and remember, a little knowledge can be a powerful thing.